Working with state and class component. I've started here by changing the app component into a class component so we can talk about working with state. When we think about state having to do with processes or applications, it's often helpful to think about it in the metaphor of a vending machine. When we use a vending machine, we input an initial value. That is, we swipe a card, we put some cash in, we put some coins in, and then we interact with the vending machine. When we interact, it decreases the amount of money that the vending machine has and then produces some result. So we're looking at three different steps in this metaphor: setting up the initial value, doing some type of interaction, and then producing some type of effect. For the vending machine, the producing the effect step is usually getting something, getting a drink, getting a candy bar, getting something from the vending machine. So we need to think of these three steps: preparing initial values, doing an interaction, and then producing an effect, as working within the conceptual space of React. So if we're setting up some initial values, especially using a class component, then we probably need to create a property. A property, remember, is part of an object, is a value the object keeps track of, part of its properties, its collection of values. So if we want to use or create, that is, a value within a class component, then we need to create that value when it is constructing things. In other words, we need to use the constructor method. So within this class component that already has a render method, I'm now going to add a constructor method. So constructor right here, open and closing parentheses to tell it's a method, and then open and closing curly brackets for the body of the method itself. Now, when we use the constructor method in a class component, we need to also make sure it has props. So props, as a reminder, is just a shorthand for properties. This is something all components get. They get because React converts elements and attributes to objects and properties, props in this case. So we need to make sure if we are accepting props, we are also using super and sending React component the same props we're getting. This will verify right here that we're getting props as a constructor, as a class component, and React component, the thing we are extending, is also getting props. And we can tell, so if we put the cursor over super, we see constructor React.component, and notice it says props as its parameters as well, and we have props for our parameter. Notice the cursor right here in parentheses, parameter. We are accepting props, and we are passing props on to super, and as a reminder, props is just abbreviation for properties. So in our constructor then, after we've done that work, we need to create a new value. And values within objects are called properties. So we want to reference inside of this method a sister property or method, which means we want the keyword this. So THIS and then period. So this and then something. In this case, we want this.state. So notice right here, as soon as I started typing it, it says in parentheses property React.component, which meaning React component has a state. So this.state inside of a class component is just something we need to remember about class components in React. They have props, so this.props, and they also have state, this.state. In both cases, props and state are properties of an object based on this class. Or in other words, the values they're keeping have to be properties, and so to reference them, this.props and this.state. So let's go ahead and set state to a value. I'm going to set state to the value of Dan right here, just Dan. So it's equal to the string Dan. And now I've set up, I'm going to go ahead and save this file. So Control S in Windows. I've now done the first step. So the three steps in the vending machine metaphor are prepare the initial value, right? We're putting some money into the vending machine. And the next step is to do some type of interaction. Well, when we do interactions in the browser doesn't call them interactions. The browser calls them events. Events happen when any form of input happens in the browser. So the term input is incredibly vague. It could be anything from a double click of the mouse to pressing a keyboard to loading different things. There are a very large number of possible events that can happen in a web browser. What we want though, or at least for this example, is we want to, when you click a mouse on something, we want to do something. That's going to be our interaction, or again, in a browser, the event. So we've prepared the initial value, step 1 of the 3 steps of the vending machine metaphor. Prepared the initial value, we put some coins into the vending machine. Now we want to do some type of interaction. Well, again, events happen in a web browser. Events also happen as part of named attributes. So what do I mean by that? So notice down here in the render method, I just have this paragraph tag and it just says hi. This is not particularly useful for building an interaction. So let's use the parentheses to use multiple lines of JSX, JavaScript XML. So if we're using JSX, we have to remember its 3 rules. 1 root element, all elements must close, only JavaScript expressions are allowed. So let's go ahead and use a division to be the root of all the JSX I'm about to write. So let's give the user some instructions. So I'm going to use a header 2 to make sure it's a little bit bigger to just give them some instructions here. Now I could use a paragraph tag or I could use other ones. I've just chosen to use header 2 in this case. So and the instructions are click a button to change name, and I put a little exclamation point just because I want to be silly about it. So now let's include the thing we want to interact with. Now remember, when we use the browser, there's actually a number of different elements that are built into HTML, hypertext markup language, that users know they can interact with. One of those examples is a button. We understand a button as something we interact with. We click it and something happens, right? That's an interaction. So let's go ahead and use a button. Now we want to use a named attribute for this event. So all events that happen on attributes, things like clicking, double clicking, pressing keys on the keyboard, etc., 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 all can be caught, that is captured, and we can do something with by using on lowercase o and then the name of the event we want. And notice as soon as I started typing, I typed on and it went, oh, do you mean on abort capture, on animation end capture, on animation iteration? And this will go on and on and on. And that's just the A's and the B's. We want though on click, capital C. So notice as soon as we put a C, it says, oh, do you mean on can play capture, blah, 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 blah. And we want on click. Notice it's lowercase o, uppercase C. And of course, notice right here, as Visual Studio Code shows us in parentheses, this is a JSX attribute. So we need to give this a value. So right now, I'm just going to put open and close curly brackets right here. And then I need to put something on the button so we can interact with it. And I'm just going to say, click me right here. Me, yeah, right here. And I will save this. So let's see what this code looks like before I add any interactions. Because this is a visual medium. We're doing something in the browser. We want to give some instructions to the user and provide them something to interact with. So let's go ahead and test this code. So verifying I am in the correct folder down here in terminal, and I am. I'm looking at example. It matches example over here. In which case, because this is React, npm run start will run the start script of npm run start, and it will open in my default web browser, which is Google Chrome. So starting the development server and giving it just a few moments to load everything. Then we will see, what just happened? It said JSX attributes must only be assigned a non-empty expression. So let's take that back out because I've got an error. So, okay, it's not ready for that yet. So let's fix our code right here and then save it. Okay, now it's compiled successfully. So we're using npm run start to test our code in real time. We're doing something and then it's doing something and then we're doing something and it's doing something, and it allows us to test everything. So it said it compiled successfully and shows this in the nice color green. Let's verify that. Oh gosh, what if we refresh this? There we go. Okay, whew, right? Just in case, let's refresh and make sure everything's working correctly. So we have click button to change name using header 2, and we have our loaded button, click me. And if we click it, nothing really happens, but that's okay. That's okay. So now we're prepared to move into that second step, right? Again, coming back to this vending machine metaphor, we've prepared the initial value, this.state, as part of a class component. And now we want to do the interaction. So I started to do it before, but I didn't finish it. So let's go ahead and do the onClick right here, lowercase o, uppercase C. It's equal to open and closing curly brackets. Within those, I'm going to use an arrow function. So open and closing parentheses and point between the parameters to the body right here. This is what I want. So right now, this doesn't actually do anything, right? We've just got an arrow function, but it's not doing anything. So I'm going to do something a little bit weird. I'm going to press enter right here. So the value of the onClick attribute is going to be an arrow function. Inside the arrow function, I want to do something. Now, this becomes another case of memorizing how React works. It's just something we need to remember. I want to change this.state, which means I need to use a special method that is part of React component. Remember that when one class extends another, it gets everything that class has. So, because app extends React.component, I get for free a method called setState. Which means if I want to reference a sister property or method within another method and I'm inside render, I need the this keyword. This dot, and then it selected it for me. It said, oh, you're probably going to use setState, and I am. setState. The setState method changes whatever the value of this.state is. Currently, this.state is equal to Dan. I'm going to change this to be equal to John. Right here, put a semicolon at the end. When we click the button, it will call this.setState. setState, remember, is a method that we extended from React.component we got for free. And again, it's just a case of learning this method. And so down here we see click me. Well, that's not terribly helpful because we want to show that something is actually changing, right? Coming back to that metaphor of the vending machine. We put money in, we do an interaction, which we're about to do, and then it produces some result or some effect, right? That third step. So let's actually show what this value is. My name is, and then we're using open and closing curly brackets as an expression. Again, that third rule of JSX. First rule being one root element. Second rule being all elements must close. Third rule being only JavaScript expressions. So we want the value of a variable. Again, we're inside the render method. Whenever we want to reference a sister property or method, when we're inside another one, we can do this. That's state. Right here. Okay. So finally, I think we're ready, right? We've setting up our initial value right here, the vending machine metaphor. We've got an interaction. We're going to click on this button, and then we're going to, inside this button, call this.setState, which will change the value of state. And so initially, we will see this.state being equal to Dan. When we click a button, it will be equal to John, or at least hopefully. So let's go ahead and save this file. So Control S in Windows, and it compiled successfully. So let's see if everything worked out the way we wanted it to. Okay, my name is Dan. Oh no, setState takes an object of state variables to update or a function which returns, oh gosh, everything went crazy. So what does this mean? This says setState takes an object. So gosh, right? It looks like we can't just use a string, it's expecting an object. So whenever an error like this happens, let's look at what it said. So this takes an object of state variables to update or a function which returns an object of state variables. So the key word here is object. So, okay, all right. Let's change this.state to be equal to an object. So open and closing curly brackets, right? Let's put Dan right here inside this. But we now have an object, not just a string, we have an object. So we got to give it a property. So let's call it name and set name equal to Dan. And now we don't need this little semicolon. We're going to put it outside of this. So now we have this.state.name, the name property of the this.state object. So down here then, we want this.state.name. And now here for setState, the error we had is we want to change this. And it said it accepted an object. So let's give it open and closing curly brackets and name. So just like we did up here, but this time change name to John. So we're going to save this. And now it's compiled successfully, but let's talk through what change I just did. I started using a string variable, but it said, no, you need an object. So I went back and changed it to an object. We have open and closing curly brackets. And I gave it a property, name, with the value of Dan. Down here then, again, this is the first step of the vending machine, setting up our initial values. Down here, when we do the interaction, we're changing setState, so change what state is, to an object with a property of name and the value of John. So it would change this.state to a new object with name John. And then we will see, just like we saw before, this.state.name, the property of state called name. And if everything's working correctly, finally we can be done with this, right? My name is Dan. Let's go ahead and refresh just in case. My name is Dan. My name is John, right? So what we learned from this is that setState and this.state should be objects, right? We saw setState kind of got confused when we didn't use objects, but that's fine. But these are the 3 steps of the vending machine we did, right? Thinking of state. We set up an initial value, we did an interaction of some kind called an event in a browser, and then it produced some type of effect. In this case, it changed this.state.name right here, .state.name, and this.state was used inside of an arrow function. Now, let me pause here and talk about why I used an arrow function. So let's say that did not happen. I'm going to take out this arrow function right here, and it's going to put some red squiggly lines until I fix everything. Take out the semicolon and stop it there. Let's say I did this, right? This would seem to make sense, right? That onClick to be equal to this.setState, and everything seemed to work out. Well, it compiled successfully, right? It seems to have worked in terminal. Let's go over here. Oh gosh. It said maximum update depth exceeded. This can happen when a component repeatedly calls setState inside of component will update, blah, 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 blah. Oh gosh, what does this all mean? Well, it's telling us something kind of important. It's telling us that there is no this at the document level. So what do I mean by that? Events, just like in traditional web development, happen at the document level. There is no this. It's getting really, really confused. It's saying, okay, well, your onClick is equal to a this, so I'm trying to call a this inside of a this, and I'm trying to figure this out, and it exceeded the call limit, which is to say it kept looping and 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 looping. And it did it all so fast that it just ran out of space. And it said, whoops, I don't know what to do. I kept trying to do the thing you told me and it was wrong. So we can fix this by saying, hey, let's use an arrow function. Now I'm going to use a shorthand and just write this right here, which I can also do using an arrow function. And now this says, hey, for your onClick, set this to an arrow function. And we know from JavaScript ES6, and arrow functions are kind of weird. They're not technically objects. So when we create a function using the function keyword, we're creating an object. When we create a number, we're creating an object. When we create a string, we're creating an object. And of course, when we have a class, it's just a future object. Arrow functions are not objects. So what this means is arrow functions do not have their own this. Because again, we use this to refer to a sister property or method inside of another one. Arrow functions don't have a this. Or if you prefer, we just use arrow functions inside of event attributes. We have them right here. So in which case, now with this file saved, come back over to Google Chrome. If I refresh this just in case, you see it goes back to Dan and John. So as a summary then, think about the vending machine metaphor when we work with state inside class components. We set up an initial value, we do an interaction, which are called events within the browser, and then it produces some type of effect. In this case, the effect it produces is that we change the this.state value. But then we saw when we were working with setState, we have to use objects, which is okay. So we set up this.state as an object. We used setState with its own object right here. And then finally, we saw that when that happens, that this.state, that name, changes, and we saw the changed update. So this has been a review of working with state within class components. Remembering that vending machine model, setting up an initial value, changing that value through some type of interaction, again called events within the web browser, and then seeing some type of effect as a result of that. In this case, changing this.state.name.